He humiliated me in front of everyone for a woman he barely knew, and I couldn't believe I married him. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. That night at dinner, I couldn't believe my ears. Brandon kept making jokes at my expense, comparing everything about me to Vanessa, the new woman he had been seeing at work. He laughed as if it was harmless fun, but the looks on my parents' faces told me differently. I felt frozen, my heart sinking with every word. I had married a man I thought loved me, someone I trusted completely, and yet here he was openly humiliating me in front of everyone I cared about. The worst part was that everyone around me seemed to go quiet, unsure how to react. My parents exchanged concerned glances, but Brandon didn't care. Vanessa had no idea what he was doing, and I realized how deep this betrayal went. My mind raced. 6 years of marriage, of shared dreams and sacrifices, all being disrespected for a fleeting crush. I wanted to explode, to shout, to make him see what he was doing, but something inside me stopped me. I realized that reacting in the moment might give him the satisfaction he clearly craved. Instead, I swallowed the shame and silently vowed to make him regret every word. After the dinner, I retreated to our bedroom, shaking and crying. I felt a mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. Brandon didn't even seem to notice, absorbed in texting Vanessa. It was like I had become invisible, a mere obstacle in his pursuit of excitement. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head, his smirk, the way he spoke, the way my parents looked. I realized that his disrespect wasn't just a moment. It was part of a pattern. He thought he could humiliate me, control my emotions, and get away with it. I wasn't going to let that happen. The next morning, I started paying attention to everything he did. I noticed how careful he had been to hide details about his lunch meetings, how he would delete messages, and how he suddenly became more protective of his phone. It was obvious he didn't want me to find out. But the fire inside me had grown stronger. I knew I couldn't let this go. This wasn't just about a fight. It was about respect, dignity, and taking back control of my life. Over the next few days, I began to quietly gather evidence. Receipts, small clues, even witnesses who had seen Brandon and Vanessa together. I kept it hidden, pretending everything was normal, all while my mind plotted the moment when Brandon would finally understand that actions have consequences. Every small detail I collected became ammunition, and with every passing day, my determination grew. He had humiliated me once, but I would make sure he never had the chance to do it again. By the end of the week, I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in months. The humiliation had sparked something stronger than anger. It gave me clarity. I wasn't going to beg for respect. I wasn't going to plead for loyalty. Brandon had underestimated me, and soon he would see the full consequences of underestimating the woman he thought he could break. From that night onward, everything changed. I wasn't the same Emily who had sat quietly at the dinner table, embarrassed and heartbroken. I had started a journey that would test my patience, my courage, and my strength. But most importantly, it would teach Brandon that you can't humiliate someone without paying the price. After that humiliating dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about Brandon and Vanessa. Something inside me told me this wasn't just a one-time thing. I started noticing little signs. His phone would light up and he would quickly hide it. His schedule suddenly seemed secretive, and he had become more distant at home. My heart sank as I realized I needed to find the truth for myself. One evening, while Brandon was at work, I went into his office to grab a file. That's when I noticed something odd, an envelope tucked behind some papers. Inside, I found hotel receipts, small gift receipts, and even notes about dinners he had claimed were work meetings. My hands shook as I realized the full extent of his betrayal. These weren't innocent interactions. They were deliberate, secretive, and repeated. Brandon had been sneaking around behind my back, and I had been blind to it. I felt sick to my stomach, but at the same time, a strange clarity settled in. I couldn't trust him anymore, not his words, not his promises. I confronted him gently at first, hoping he might confess or explain, but he acted as if nothing was wrong. He laughed it off and said Vanessa was just a friend, as if the evidence in my hands didn't exist. I couldn't believe his audacity. How could someone look at you, knowing the pain they caused, and treat it like a joke? That moment broke something in me. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was his complete lack of remorse, his arrogance in thinking he could keep lying and get away with it. I realized then that I had to take control of my own life. I couldn't rely on him to change or to apologize. I had to protect myself, my dignity, and my future. I began quietly observing him, noting every lie, every inconsistency. I made mental notes of when he left, where he went, and who he met. I even found texts hidden in deleted folders, messages where he had planned secret meetings with Vanessa, trying to make it seem casual. Each piece of evidence I uncovered confirmed the betrayal and strengthened my resolve. But I didn't confront him immediately. I needed a plan, something that would ensure he couldn't manipulate or humiliate me again. I started organizing everything: receipts, messages, dates, and witnesses. I didn't tell anyone yet. This was my private strategy. Every time I saw him flaunting normalcy, smiling as if nothing was wrong, my anger grew. But so did my focus. I reminded myself that this wasn't about revenge in the moment. It was about reclaiming my life. I refused to be a victim. Brandon had shattered the trust in our marriage, but he had also ignited something in me I didn't know existed. I was determined to rebuild my life on my own terms, with him powerless to stop me. By the end of that week, I had a clear picture of the betrayal and a silent plan forming in my mind. I wouldn't let him control the narrative anymore. The pieces were in my hands, and soon he would see that the woman he tried to humiliate was stronger, smarter, and ready to fight back. Nights became the hardest part. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Brandon and everything he had done. My mind wouldn't stop replaying his words, the way he had humiliated me, and the image of him smiling while I suffered. Sleep felt impossible. During the day, I felt numb, barely able to focus, but I forced myself to go through the motions. At work, I buried myself in projects. I threw myself into tasks, meetings, and deadlines, trying to drown out the thoughts of betrayal. My coworkers noticed my intensity, but no one knew the real reason behind it. I pretended everything was fine at home, smiling and nodding when Brandon spoke, hiding the storm that was raging inside me. It was exhausting, but I knew I couldn't show weakness. One evening, I decided I couldn't hold it in anymore. I confronted Brandon about his behavior, demanding to know why he treated me with such disrespect. I expected some kind of apology, maybe even guilt. Instead, he laughed. He smirked as if he had won some game, making jokes at my expense again. That laughter cut deeper than any insult he had thrown before. I felt rage boil up inside me. His behavior wasn't just cruel. It was deliberate, and he took pride in it. I realized then that my humiliation wasn't private. It wasn't a mistake or a slip. Brandon wore it like a badge of honor, showing everyone that he could belittle me and get away with it. My heart sank. This was more than betrayal. It was a demonstration of power. He didn't care about my feelings or our marriage. He wanted control, and he used my shame to feed it. For days, I felt trapped between anger and sadness. I questioned every choice I had made, wondering if I had been blind, naive, or too trusting. I couldn't understand how someone I loved so much could treat me with such cruelty. Every memory of our life together felt tainted, every smile and promise overshadowed by the knowledge that he had been unfaithful and arrogant all along. But in the middle of the pain, a small spark of determination grew. I knew I couldn't let him define me or my life. I refused to let his laughter and cruelty break me. The humiliation was real, but it had awakened something inside me, a strength I didn't know I had. I decided to channel my anger into action, to plan my next steps carefully, and to make sure that he would never have the power to hurt me like this again. By the end of that week, though I still felt the weight of betrayal, I felt a shift. I was no longer just a victim of Brandon's cruelty. I was someone who could fight back, who could take control, and who could turn this heartbreak into a path toward justice and self-respect. I realized that just confronting Brandon wasn't enough. He had shown me that words meant nothing to him, and that he enjoyed humiliating me. If I wanted him to understand the consequences of his actions, I needed a plan that was precise and powerful. I needed to take back control of my life in a way he couldn't ignore. I started by carefully collecting evidence. I went through bank statements, looking for unusual charges that might link him to Vanessa. I found dinner receipts, hotel bills, and small gifts he had claimed were for work purposes or friends. Each piece of paper, each record, was proof of his lies, and the more I gathered, the clearer the picture became. I felt a sense of power growing inside me, replacing the helplessness I had felt for so long. Next, I quietly reached out to people who might have seen him with Vanessa, colleagues who had attended meetings or dinners, and even neighbors who might have noticed late-night visits. I asked questions carefully, pretending to be curious or concerned, making sure not to raise suspicion. Every little confirmation I got added to my growing collection of proof. I wasn't doing this for revenge in the petty sense. I wanted him to see that he no longer had control over me, that his arrogance and lies could no longer manipulate my life. At the same time, I observed his habits. I noted when he left for work, who he met, and how he tried to cover his tracks. I discovered patterns in his behavior, small things he thought were clever, but which now became weaknesses I could exploit. I kept everything organized, not just for myself, but for the moment when I would need to confront him with facts he couldn't deny. I also worked on myself mentally. I reminded myself that my goal wasn't public embarrassment or revenge for humiliation's sake. This was about reclaiming my dignity and showing Brandon that I was no longer the person he could control. Every step I took was calculated, every move intentional. I felt a sense of calm purpose for the first time in weeks. The anger was still there, but now it was focused, directed toward a clear outcome. Even as I carried on with daily life, pretending everything was normal, I was building a foundation for change. Work, friends, and family saw me as composed, but beneath the surface, I was preparing for a confrontation that would shift the power between us. Brandon thought he was untouchable, that he could humiliate and manipulate me without consequence. I was determined to prove him wrong. By the end of that period, I had enough evidence to confront him decisively. I knew the moment had to be perfect, not rash, not fueled by anger alone, but precise, undeniable, and in a way that he couldn't escape. I had turned my hurt and humiliation into strategy. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt in control, ready to reclaim my life, and prepared to make him face the reality of what he had done. Brandon didn't change. He continued to show off Vanessa at every event, laughing and acting as if he had no consequences to face. At family dinners, parties, and even casual gatherings, he strutted around proudly, making sure everyone knew he was with her. It was infuriating, but I kept my calm. I had my plan, and I knew patience was part of it. At the same time, I started taking small steps to cut him off from the circles he relied on. I subtly corrected misinformation he spread at work, ensuring that colleagues and friends saw the truth without it seeming like I was attacking him. I quietly reminded family members of his past actions, careful to phrase things so that they began noticing patterns of disrespect and dishonesty on their own. Brandon was blind to it, thinking he was still in control, but I was slowly shifting the balance. The turning point came at a major work party. Brandon, ever the showman, tried to impress one of his key business partners by boasting about a big deal he claimed to have secured. I knew the truth behind that claim because I had paid attention and gathered the facts. I approached the partner discreetly, providing the right information in a casual, confident way. The partner's expression changed as they realized Brandon had lied. Suddenly, his credibility cracked. I watched from a distance as whispers began to circulate and people exchanged skeptical glances. It wasn't revenge in a dramatic sense, but the effect was immediate. Brandon looked around, sensing the shift, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Vanessa, realizing the situation was turning against them, grew nervous and silent. For the first time, Brandon experienced a small taste of the consequences of his arrogance. He had humiliated me countless times, thinking he could escape the fallout, but karma had started quietly working, and I felt a spark of satisfaction. That moment gave me more than confidence. It gave me clarity. I realized that his downfall didn't have to be loud or dramatic. It could be subtle, precise, and calculated. Each lie he told, each insult he threw at me, and each attempt to flaunt his power became a tool I could use to reclaim my life. The satisfaction wasn't in humiliating him publicly. It was in watching him lose the unearned control he thought he had over everyone. From that day on, my resolve strengthened. I knew I was on the right path. Brandon wouldn't get away with destroying my dignity or taking my life for granted. Every careful move I made, every bit of evidence I collected, and every subtle correction I applied was building toward the moment when he would finally see the consequences of his actions. Karma had started, and it was only the beginning. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt a sense of justice in motion. It was quiet, controlled, and inevitable. Brandon may have thought he was untouchable, but the cracks had begun, and I was ready to turn them into a complete collapse. I waited for the right moment to confront Brandon privately. I knew yelling or losing my temper would only give him the satisfaction of seeing me react. I needed him to feel the weight of his actions clearly and personally. That evening, when the house was quiet and Vanessa wasn't around, I asked him to sit with me. He looked confused, maybe even amused, thinking this would be another argument he could brush off. I started speaking calmly, my voice steady but firm. I didn't accuse or shout. I stated the facts, the reality of what he had done. I told him how his arrogance and betrayal weren't just hurting me. They were destroying the foundation of our marriage, the trust we had built over 6 years. I reminded him of all the promises he had made, the life we had planned together, and how carelessly he had thrown it all aside. Then I went further, showing him the ripple effect of his actions. I spoke about his reputation at work, how colleagues were beginning to notice inconsistencies in his stories and behavior, and how even friends and family were questioning his integrity. I didn't have to raise my voice. Every word I said carried the weight of truth, and that truth was undeniable. I could see his confident mask beginning to crack, the first signs of uncertainty creeping into his expression. I told him that his behavior wasn't just a private problem, it was public in its consequences. The lies, the humiliation, the secret meetings, and the disrespect had created a pattern, and patterns don't stay hidden forever. I reminded him that control built on fear and manipulation is fragile, and once it starts to break, it collapses quickly. I could see the shock on his face because he was used to controlling me through fear, anger, and humiliation. He wasn't used to reason, to calm and deliberate words that carried authority. I made it clear that I wasn't angry in a way he could exploit. I was resolute. I wasn't begging for apologies or explanations. I was pointing out the reality of his choices and showing him the consequences he had ignored for so long. I watched as he struggled to find words, his confidence faltering. For once, he didn't have the upper hand, and I could feel that shift in the air. By the end of our conversation, he was silent, and I knew he realized something important. I was no longer the person he could intimidate or humiliate at will. I wasn't reacting out of fear or desperation. I was in control of myself, my emotions, and my next steps. The confrontation wasn't about vengeance. It was about asserting my power, reclaiming my life, and showing him that his arrogance had limits. That night, I felt a sense of calm strength I hadn't known before. Brandon had underestimated me, believing that humiliation and lies would keep me in place. But for the first time, he saw the truth. I was no longer his victim. I was ready to take the steps necessary to reclaim what he had tried to destroy. The tension between Brandon, Vanessa, and me started growing in ways I could use to my advantage. Vanessa began noticing that Brandon was no longer completely under her control. She became anxious, sending him messages demanding that he make a choice between us. She wanted him to commit fully to her, but he refused. He still tried to maintain the illusion of being with both of us, not realizing that his arrogance was making him careless. I watched quietly as their tension grew. Brandon didn't notice how obvious his lies and manipulations were becoming. He still thought he could manage the situation, charm everyone, and act as if nothing was wrong. But his attempts to cover his tracks were sloppy, and little pieces of the truth began slipping out without him realizing it. During family dinners and casual gatherings with friends, I paid attention to his behavior. I let conversations flow naturally, never forcing anything, but making sure I asked questions or mentioned topics that revealed discrepancies in his stories. Sometimes it was as simple as a casual comment about a meeting he said he had, which didn't match what colleagues had mentioned. Other times, it was something as small as a neighbor noticing him leaving late at night for secret dinners. Each time, people began to notice the pattern. Vanessa's panic only added to the cracks in Brandon's facade. She started calling him repeatedly, questioning him in front of me sometimes, trying to pressure him into showing loyalty to her. He would deflect or make excuses, and it became obvious to anyone watching that he was juggling relationships and lying to maintain control. I stayed calm through all of it, watching as the tension worked in my favor. I also started keeping track of the small slips he made in front of friends and family. Little inconsistencies, minor contradictions, and excuses that didn't add up. Everything was evidence of his true nature. I never had to accuse him publicly. The truth revealed itself naturally through his own actions and words. People began seeing him not as the charming husband I had once believed in, but as someone deceitful and self-serving. By letting the tension between him and Vanessa grow, I was able to create a situation where his lies and indiscretions came to light without me having to force anything. Brandon's need to maintain control backfired, exposing him to everyone around him. I stayed composed, patient, and strategic, knowing that this slow unraveling would have a far greater impact than a single confrontation ever could. With every slip he made, every moment of panic from Vanessa, and every inconsistency noticed by others, Brandon's image started to crumble. It was subtle but undeniable. He had underestimated me, thinking I would react emotionally or irrationally. Instead, I stayed steady, letting his own actions reveal the truth. I could see the shift happening. Friends and family began questioning his integrity, and I knew that my plan was working exactly as it should. For the first time, I felt that real change was happening. Brandon's control over me, over Vanessa, and over the perception of those around him was weakening. The tension I had carefully observed and managed was turning the situation in my favor, and I was ready to see it through to the end. The big family gathering arrived, and Brandon was in his element. He strutted around, showing off what he called his perfect life with Vanessa. He laughed, bragged about trips and dinners, and acted as if everyone should admire his choices. I stayed calm, observing everything, knowing this was the perfect moment. I had everything I needed: evidence, witnesses, and a plan to turn the tables completely. I started by casually steering conversations toward topics where his lies could be exposed. I asked about his work dinners and trips, mentioning dates and places that didn't match his stories. At first, he smiled, confident that he could talk his way through it. But I had witnesses on my side, family members and friends who had seen him with Vanessa or knew the truth about his actions. As the discrepancies became clear, I watched his confidence falter. Then I took the next step. I quietly presented the evidence I had collected: hotel receipts, messages, and small gifts that proved his infidelity. I did it calmly, without anger or yelling, letting the facts speak for themselves. I called on a few people who had seen him with Vanessa, letting them confirm the details naturally. Brandon tried to interrupt, tried to laugh it off, but no one listened to him anymore. The truth was out, and it couldn't be denied. Vanessa's reaction was immediate. She looked around, realizing that she had been nothing more than a pawn in his games. Her face turned pale as the evidence stacked up, and she left the gathering quietly, humiliated and defeated. Brandon, on the other hand, was frozen. For the first time, he had no words, no charm, no excuses that could save him. He was shamed publicly in front of everyone he cared about, or thought he cared about. The shift in energy was tangible. Family members who had been hesitant to believe me began whispering among themselves, confirming the pattern of lies and betrayal. Friends who had admired Brandon's confidence and charm now saw him for what he truly was. I could see the weight of guilt and fear settling on him, the realization that his arrogance had finally caught up with him. I stayed composed throughout. I didn't need to yell or make dramatic accusations. The evidence, the witnesses, and the truth were enough. Brandon's attempts to maintain control had completely backfired. The man who once humiliated me, flaunted his affair, and thought he could manipulate everyone was now exposed, powerless, and discredited. That night, I felt a sense of victory, not from malice, but from justice. The humiliation I had suffered, the betrayal I had endured, and the anger I had felt were all validated. Brandon's downfall was complete, and it happened because of his own arrogance and lies. I finally realized that patience, strategy, and truth were far more powerful than confrontation fueled by anger. By the end of the evening, the tables had turned completely. I was no longer the one humiliated or powerless. Brandon was exposed, Vanessa was gone, and I stood tall, knowing that I had reclaimed my dignity, my life, and my sense of control. The moment wasn't just about punishment. It was about showing that betrayal and arrogance always come with consequences. After the confrontation at the family gathering, I felt a sense of relief and clarity I hadn't felt in years. Brandon's arrogance and lies were exposed, and for the first time, I truly realized I didn't need him to define my life. I was determined to take full control of my future and rebuild on my own terms. I started by making legal arrangements to separate from Brandon. The process was straightforward because I had been careful to gather all necessary documentation and evidence over the past months. I made sure everything was done properly, leaving no room for manipulation or disputes. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life and making sure I could move forward without him interfering. Next, I focused on the house. Brandon had tried to manipulate me into staying, using guilt and his charm to make me feel trapped. But I knew that home was a symbol of his control, and I couldn't let that continue. I sold the house and moved into a place of my own, somewhere I could feel safe, independent, and in charge. Every box I packed and every item I placed in my new home felt like a step away from the past and closer to freedom. Friends and family became my support system. I leaned on them emotionally and allowed myself to heal with their encouragement. Their belief in me reminded me of my own strength and resilience. I also threw myself into my career, taking on new projects and responsibilities that challenged me and gave me a renewed sense of purpose. Each success reminded me that my value wasn't tied to Brandon or his opinions. Brandon, on the other hand, began facing the consequences of his actions. People at work and in social circles started distancing themselves, no longer willing to overlook his arrogance and dishonesty. I didn't need to push this. His own behavior had led to his downfall. Watching him experience the repercussions of his betrayal reinforced my understanding that control built on lies and manipulation always comes at a cost. As weeks turned into months, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. I was no longer the woman who had been humiliated, ignored, and betrayed. I had regained control over my life, made independent decisions, and surrounded myself with people who truly cared for me. Every small victory, whether personal or professional, strengthened my confidence and reminded me that I was capable of thriving without him. The experience taught me that independence isn't just about living alone. It's about reclaiming your identity, setting boundaries, and refusing to let anyone dictate your worth. Brandon's betrayal, once a source of pain, became a catalyst for my growth and empowerment. I realized that the life I wanted wasn't defined by a man's choices or approval. It was defined by my own courage, decisions, and strength. By the end of this journey, I had not only separated legally and physically from Brandon, but I had also reclaimed my sense of self. I was stronger, wiser, and fully empowered. The past no longer had power over me, and the future was entirely mine to shape. Looking back, I realize how much I've changed. Brandon thought humiliating me would destroy me, that it would make me weak, dependent, and broken. But the opposite happened. Every insult, every lie, every betrayal became a lesson. I grew stronger, more focused, and more aware of my own worth. I became smarter in how I handled situations, more careful about who I trusted, and more confident in making decisions for myself. I learned that sometimes, the people who try to break you end up showing you the strength you never knew you had. The humiliation I once felt transformed into determination. I stopped worrying about revenge for the sake of anger, and instead focused on reclaiming my life, my independence, and my dignity. Each step I took, gathering evidence, observing his behavior, exposing the truth, and finally separating from him, was a building block toward a life where I no longer depended on someone else's approval or feared their control. I learned that resilience isn't just about surviving pain, it's about turning it into power. Watching Brandon face the consequences of his own choices was another lesson. He struggled socially and professionally, losing credibility and respect. I didn't need to actively attack him. His arrogance, lies, and betrayal did that for me. Karma, in its own way, delivered justice, and it was a reminder that actions have consequences, even when people think they can avoid them. As I rebuilt my life, I discovered joys I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I surrounded myself with people who genuinely cared, pursued opportunities that challenged and inspired me, and created a space where I felt safe, respected, and in control. I learned the importance of self-respect, the power of patience, and the satisfaction of taking calm, deliberate steps toward the life I wanted. Every small victory reinforced the truth that I was capable of thriving independently. Now, I live free from toxic control, free from fear, and free from the weight of betrayal. The past no longer dictates my present or my future. I carry the lessons with me, not as scars, but as tools to guide my decisions, protect my heart, and strengthen my resolve. I understand that my power comes from within, not from anyone else's validation. Brandon's story ended in the consequences he brought on himself, while mine became a story of resilience, justice, and growth. I proved that humiliation and betrayal do not have to define a person. They can, instead, reveal your strength, sharpen your mind, and give you the courage to take control of your life. I am no longer the person who sat silently through his arrogance. I am someone unstoppable, confident, and fully aware of her own worth. In the end, this journey showed me that life can be unfair, people can betray, and cruelty can strike, but the power to rise above it all lies within. Karma may deliver justice, but true victory comes from reclaiming your life, your dignity, and your sense of self. I did all of that, and now I move forward stronger than ever.